You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Now presenting Mongol invasion of Kievan Rus. In the 1200s, the expansive Mongol Empire launched an offensive against Kievan Rus, decisively defeating and laying waste to many of its cities. The most populous, such as Kiev with its 50,000 residents and Chernigov with 30,000, were decimated. The assault and subsequent fall of Kiev in 1240 is widely considered to signify the end of the Kievan Rus era. However, a number of significant Ruses, territories and cities in the northwest, like the Novgorod Republic, Pskov, Smolensk, Polotsk, Vitebsk, and likely Rostov and Uglich, were spared major damage or avoided destruction during the invasion. The Mongols first showcased their military might in the region at the Battle of the Kalka River in May 1223, claiming victory against several Rus principalities and the remainders of the Cuman forces led by Khotan. This initial encounter was more of a scouting mission, allowing the Mongols to size up their opponents. Batu Khan led the subsequent full-scale assault on Rus from 1237 to 1241. The campaign was cut short due to the Mongol practice of succession after the death of Ogedei Khan. As a result of this invasion, nearly all the Rus principalities were coerced into becoming tributaries under the dominion of the Golden Horde, with the notable exceptions of the Novgorod Republic and a few others. The invasion had long-lasting effects and coincided with the fragmentation of Kievan Rus in the 13th century. It significantly impacted the historical trajectory of Eastern Europe, ultimately leading to the emergence of three distinct nations from the East Slavic population, what are now known as Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Part 1. Background. Well, before Batu Khan led his campaign in 1237, the Mongols harbored ambitions to expand their empire into Eastern Europe. The seeds for this venture were planted by Genghis Khan, who commissioned his eldest son, Jochi, to bring the territories north of the Selenga River and in the Irtysh Valley under Mongol control, a mandate that stretched into Eastern Europe's domains. Nevertheless, these plans did not fully materialize before Genghis Khan's death. It was only between 1222 and 1224 that two of his generals, Sube'etei and Jebe, undertook a significant expedition with an army of 30,000 throughout Transcaucasia and southeastern Europe. A journey deemed to be exploratory by many, although Mongol sources suggest it was a precursor to a larger offensive meant to integrate the forces of Jochi and conquer regions including the Cumans, Alans, Hungary, and the Rus. In 1235, Mongol leaders convened at a Kurultai, a council, where they reiterated their ambitions to invade Europe, echoing earlier goals. Following this Kurultai, Batu Khan, Jochi's son, assumed the mantle of leadership. The mobilization for the invasion began in earnest. The Mongol forces, now buttressed by units from various tribes such as the Bashkirs, consolidated in the Caspian steppes in autumn 1236 under Batu's command. The Volga Bulgaria was the first to fall victim to this united Mongol onslaught. As for the people of Kievan Rus, they were suddenly beset by an enigmatic and powerful army from the distant east. A chronicler from that region described the invaders as unknown, with their origins and faith veiled in mystery, known only to the divine and perhaps scholarly men. The Cumans, formerly known for their plundering, had already encountered the Mongol force and urgently sought Rus's help, warning that the invaders who claimed their territory would soon target Rus's lands. Two princes, Mstislav the Bold and Mstislav Romanovich the Old, rallied to face the invading Mongols, but suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of the Kalka River on April 1, 1223. This defeat left Russes vulnerable, yet the Mongols withdrew, only to return more than a decade later with a strengthened and formidable force that caught the divided Russes' princes off guard. Mongol leadership comprised numerous descendants of Genghis Khan, known as Chingizids, who played crucial roles in this campaign. They joined forces with Sube'etei, who had already proved his mettle in the north, overcoming numerous kingdoms as noted in The Secret History of the Mongols. These Chingizids, including Batu and others, assembled a vast army which subdued the Bashkirs and then set their sights on the strategically positioned Volga Bulgaria. In the wake of the Mongol threat, The Volga Bulgaria had tried to mend fences with their Rus neighbors, focusing on fortifying against the anticipated Mongol invasion. Unfortunately, all the Bulgars' defenses were in vain, as they were swiftly overpowered and conquered by spring 1237. The Mongol campaign pressed on relentlessly, targeting the Polovtsians and Alans, and extending their conquests further. They meticulously prepared for their next major objective, an incursion into Rus, with Batu's force being bolstered by additional contingents following victories against other tribes. The stage was set by the end of 1237 for a winter assault on northeastern Rus, heralding yet another chapter in the sweeping Mongol expansion across Eurasia. Part 2: Invasion of Batu Khan. In the latter part of 1236, an immense Mongolian empire's cavalry, estimated to be 40,000 strong and led by Batu Khan and Subutai, moved across the Volga River to invade Volga Bulgaria. This swift campaign decimated the local Bulgar resistance, as well as that of the Cumans, Kipchaks, and Alans, in just a month. Before this event, a Hungarian friar named Julian had traveled to the edge of Rus territory and discovered the Mongol forces poised to march as soon as winter froze the waterways. Julian recounted his encounter with Mongol delegates, previously held by Yuri II of Vladimir Suzdal, in his communication to the Pope's representative in Hungary. Yuri II had received a missive from them intended for Hungary. Come November 1237, Batu Khan's emissaries approached Yuri II, pressing for his surrender. Despite what appeared to be an offer of peace from the Mongols, as recorded in the Laurentian Codex, Yuri II rejected the proposal with contempt. Although he portrayed a dismissive attitude, Yuri II did try to stave off conflict by sending the envoys away with gifts, essentially paying them off to avoid invasion. The Mongols launched simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts. One force moved against Suzdal, another along the Volga, and a third headed south to Ryazan. Led by Batu and other Mongol leaders, they besieged Ryazan and captured it after a mere 3 days. Yuri II, alarmed, dispatched his sons to challenge the Mongols, only to see them retreat in defeat. He then fled north from his burning capital. By February 1238, the horde was laying siege to Vladimir, which they overran and set ablaze, killing the ruling family in the process and forcing Yuri II to flee. However, he would not escape for long. His forces were utterly crushed by the Mongols at the Battle of the Sit River on March 4th. The Mongols continued their ruthless campaign, capturing and destroying Ryazan in late December. Every inhabitant, regardless of age or status, was massacred or violated. Subsequently, Batu Khan's dispersed forces thoroughly devastated 14 northeastern Rus cities, utilizing Chinese siege technology under the command of Tului. The town of Kozelsk put up a steadfast resistance led by their young prince, Vasily, enduring 7 weeks and inflicting Mongol casualties before falling. Myths emerged from this time, including the tale of Kitech, a town said to have sunk into a lake to escape the invasion, where it supposedly remains. Some areas like Novgorod, Pskov, Smolensk, Polotsk, Vitebsk, Rostov, and Uglich either escaped the brunt of the onslaught or were not significantly damaged. The preemptive surrender of Novgorod likely saved it from a similar fate as its neighbors. By mid-1238, Batu Khan had also wreaked havoc in Crimea and subdued Mordovia. The following year saw Chernihiv and Pereyaslav fall after protracted sieges. In December 1240, Kiev was taken despite earnest resistance. Danilo of Halych also tried to defend against the Mongols, but ultimately lost both Halych and Volodymyr. The Mongol Tartars, now aiming to reach the furthest western frontiers, invaded Hungary and Poland, capturing Pest and Esztergom on Christmas in 1241. Part 3: Age of Mongol Rule. Following their conquest, the former principalities that once composed Rus were incorporated into territories ruled by Batu, a successor of the Mongol Empire's founder, Genghis Khan. Batu established a mobile capital named Sarai, or Sarai Batu after himself, near the lower Volga River region. This domain became known as the Golden Horde. For roughly 3 centuries, most of the Rus's areas, including key principalities such as Novgorod, Smolensk, Galich, and Pskov, all acknowledged the sovereignty of the Mongols, with the exception of the Principality of Polotsk. When the Mongols and later the Turco-Mongols' control was eventually resisted and discarded, Russian history often describes the era under the term Mongol or Tatar yoke, reflecting a generally negative perspective. The Golden Horde imposed systems of population counting, taxation, and mandatory tributes from the lands they conquered, normally levied by the local rulers, who then delivered them to Sarai. By the 14th and 15th centuries, as Tatar Khanates gained power, they also began conducting slave raids aimed at the Slavic people, with the intention of participating in the slave trade with the Ottoman Empire. These attacks caused severe destruction in areas such as Muscovy and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They not only devastated those regions but also hindered the colonization of the wild fields, a name for the steppes that stretched from around 160 kilometers south of Moscow all the way to the Black Sea. The devastating impact of these slave raids was instrumental in shaping the emergence of the Cossacks. Part 4. Impact on Development. Giovanni di Plano Carpini, the envoy of the Pope, journeyed through the capital of the Rus, Kiev, in February 1246. He recounted his observations, describing the severe destruction inflicted by the Mongols on Rus. The aggressors ravaged countless settlements, obliterated fortifications, and massacred populations. A prolonged siege on Kiev eventually led to its capture and the brutal killing of its residents. Carpini's travels through these lands were marked by the grim sight of skulls and bones of the deceased scattered across the landscape. Once a bustling and populous city, Kiev had been decimated to the point where only a few hundred dwellings remained, and the surviving populace lived in harsh subjugation. The Mongol incursion profoundly impacted Kievan Rus, triggering a drastic population decline. Pre-invasion estimates suggest a population of around 7.5 million, but following the devastation, figures dropped slightly to 7 million. Reconstruction and recovery in cities such as Kiev spanned centuries, while other regions such as Novgorod continued to thrive. Meanwhile, Moscow and Tver emerged as new prosperous cities under Mongol rule, particularly Moscow, which owed much of its ascendancy to the Mongols. When Tver rebelled against the Mongols in 1327, the Prince of Moscow sided with the Mongols, crushing the revolt and in doing so, extinguishing his competition. This alignment with the Mongols elevated the Muscovite prince's status, allowing Moscow to become the religious center of the Russian Orthodox Church and bolstering the city's political power as the intermediary between the Mongols and the Rus lands. Moscow became a sanctuary for nobility seeking stability, further contributing to its growth. Although Rus forces eventually vanquished the Golden Horde in the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, Mongol influence persisted in some regions up until the stand on the Ugra River in 1480. Historians have theorized that the unification of Rus into the Russian Tsardom and the subsequent emergence of the Russian Empire might not have occurred without the Mongols' initial consolidating destruction. Trade routes that once passed through Rus territory facilitated interactions between Eastern and Western cultures, with the Mongol period having enduring effects on what would become modern Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. The Mongol invasion significantly reduced urban development within Kievan Rus. Centuries of growth were undone as many cities and strongholds were ravaged and reduced to insignificant population centers. Kiev, for instance, was reduced from a city of tens of thousands to one with merely a couple hundred homes after the siege, as documented by Plano Carpini. This decline of urban areas coincided with a cultural, craft, and commercial decay, contrasting the vibrant pre-Mongol era. It took over a century for Russian cities to recover their former stature and rebuild from the effects of Batu Khan's invasion. This slowed Russia's economic progress and shifted its historical trajectory, enabling Moscow's rise to power and contributing to the formation of a centralized Russian state. Craftsmanship also suffered greatly. Practices such as stone construction halted, and the art of creating items like glass jewelry and glazed ceramics regressed significantly, setting the Russian handicraft industry back by centuries. As Western industries advanced, Russia was left to relearn techniques and skills lost during the Mongol occupation. Population movements were a direct response to the Mongol invasion. Many fled from Batu's forces, with some from the northeastern Vladimir Suzdal and Ryazan principalities seeking safer lands to the north or in thick forests. Upon the Mongols' withdrawal, many returned to their original homes, as seen by the substantial army that Prince Yaroslav could muster for a campaign against the Lithuanians just a year after the principalities fell. Yet, this was not the end of the demographic shifts. Regions such as Vladimir and Suzdal saw recurrent Mongol aggressions in the latter half of the 13th century, leading to a gradual migration of their population towards areas around Moscow and Tver or further north. Part 5: Influence on Society. The impact of Mongol rule on the historical region of Rus has been a topic of discussion among scholars. Critics often point out that the Mongols were responsible for the downfall of Kievan Rus, the fragmentation of the Rus's people into 3 distinct groups, and for establishing a model of authoritarian governance in Russia. Nonetheless, historians acknowledge the pivotal role the Mongol governance played in shaping the rise of the Muscovy Principality. During the Mongol occupation, Muscovy adopted various administrative and organizational structures, including a system of ranking officials known as Mestnichestvo, a communications network modeled on the Mongol Ortu system, which in Russian was called Yam, leading to related terms like Yamschik and the Yamskoy Prikaz. Additionally, they developed a taxation framework, census methods, and reformed their military. Throughout this period, interactions between Slavic and Mongol elites were common. By the mid-15th century, the Tatar language had even become trendy at the court of Grand Prince Vasily II of Moscow. Some Russian nobility went as far as adopting Tatar surnames. For example, members of the Velyaminov family assumed the Turkic name Aksak, giving rise to the Aksakovs. A significant portion of 17th century Russian noble families, more than 15%, claimed either Tatar or other Asian origins. Notable families with such backgrounds include Velyaminov-Zernov, Godunov, Arseniev, Bakhmetev, Bulgakov, and Chadev, the latter tracing their lineage to the Mongol ruler Chagatai Khan, who was a son of Genghis Khan. Mongol influence was also evident in other aspects of society. Economically, the Mongols affected trade and the relative wealth of states. Religiously, notable figures had connections to the Mongol rulers like Saint Paphnutius of Borovsk, who was the grandchild of a Mongol tax officer and a nephew of Khan Burgai of the Golden Horde, converted to Christianity, becoming monk Saint Peter Tsarevich of the Horde. In jurisprudence, the Mongols' sway led to the broader application of capital punishment, which had previously been reserved for slaves in Kievan Rus, and made the use of torture a standard part of legal investigations. In Moscow, new penalties were instated, such as executing alleged traitors by decapitation and punishing thieves with branding, with death as the penalty for a third offense.